The presenter of our main talk today is Mary Carol Edwards. She coordinates the Stormwater Wetland Program at the Texas Coastal Watershed Program, which is part of the Texas Sea Grant and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Is that like your whole title? That's long. She works, how long is your business card? She works to demonstrate the benefits of designing wetlands into flood control basins in the Galveston Bay watershed. She has previously worked at landscape design and landscape architecture companies, and also in genetics labs at Baylor College of Medicine and Rice University. Mary Carol is a Houston native. She has a BA in biology and an MA in architecture from the University of Houston, and enjoys bringing both disciplines together in projects and incorporate nature in the built environment. We're so happy to welcome and pleased that you could be here with us today, Mary Carol Edwards.
This is something I'm very passionate about, so I'm glad to be able to talk to you about stormwater wetlands and wetlands in general. The title of my talk in the brochure is A Case for Living with Wetlands. So in fact, I have two paradigms that I would like to change. One of them is the conception that wetlands are something that we want to be away from us, yonder in the wilderness and not in our midst. I'd like to change that division between the outside world and the inside world when it comes to the design of cities, with wetlands being outside. And the other paradigm is that within our cities we've got numerous flood control basins. They're a necessary part of the design of this city. In fact, whenever you build something new of a certain size, it kicks in regulations for flood control basins. But often they're handled like this. It's a no man's land. It's only accessed by people with mowers, and it may be fenced off. And unfortunately, it's a waste of wonderful space that could be flood control basin, as well as habitat, water quality improvements, and green space. So I'm going to talk about three aspects of wetlands. One is, what is the point of having a wetland in this vicinity? What's so great about wetlands? And another is, what makes a stormwater wetland? What type of wetland is a stormwater wetland? And the third aspect is to look at some of them that we've been implementing in this area. I mentioned water quality. Well, wetlands are sometimes described as the kidneys of the world. They take up lots of stuff for us. Fecal bacteria, put up at the top of the list because that's something that people don't often consider. Stormwater, water that's running off the land because of rain flow, carries a lot of fecal bacteria. Gets in there when you don't pick up after your dogs, septic systems that are not maintained, and wildlife as well. But when water with fecal bacteria hits a wetland, immediately there are these biochemical natural processes that are happening. I could geek out on it. I brought a brochure back there. If you're really interested in how some of these processes work, you can pick it up. But I'll just give you the high-level view. Sediment drops out in wetlands. Pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers and so forth that we put on our lawns, all this stuff runs into the waterways. It runs first into the flood control basins, and it goes into ditches, bayous, the bays. The consequence is that we have fish kills, we have oyster bans, we have recreation bans. Most of the beach closures are as a consequence to having contaminated water from the land. Dead zones in the Gulf. All this stuff can be altered by what we do on the land. It's also habitat for wildlife. Our prairie complex, our prairie wetland complex, which was the original landscape in this area. We didn't have forests except along the bayous, and everywhere else was sort of a flat-ish mosaic of depressional wetlands and some little uplands, Mima Mounds, and we had millions of acres from Louisiana all the way down to Brownsville, stretching in about 100 miles. And this was habitat for migratory birds and an enormous diversity of wildlife. But unfortunately, because it seems to be so flat, it's easy to drain it, plow it, pave it, and as a consequence of the sprawl that we've had, we have very little of this very vital habitat left. And in fact, you can see the statistic down here, 50% of all the bird species on this continent spend some time in a wetland. There are also economic benefits. A lot of money is spent on activities which are tied in some way to wetlands. I've got down here, wetlands attract birds, and birds attract birders. In a recent conversation, I was talking with someone, why don't we say bird watching? And they said, well, it's because birding takes more than the visual sense. You listen, you experience in other ways. It's not just about watching birds, it's birding. I mentioned that this was our native landscape in this area. It's an important aspect of our aesthetic, the landscape aesthetic here. Got this link here to an article that my boss, Dr. John Jacob, wrote for the Site magazine. He says that many people have asked him, well, people say, you know, I'd love to live in a city like Seattle because you can jump on the train, jump on the bus with your skis, and then you're in the natural habitat in just a few minutes. And he says, well, this is our Mount Rainier. This is our Mount Rainier. This is our natural area, and we've paved over so much of it. It's time to change the way that we think about the natural areas in relation to the city. Flood control is another benefit of wetlands. Having plants in our floodwater removes the water into the air, not just downstream. There's groundwater maintenance, and also the force of floodwater is dissipated by the flow through a wetland. Another statistic here, maintaining 15% of the land area of a watershed in wetlands reduces the peak flow, that means like the surge of floodwater, by 60%. So imagine if the city had a number of wetlands embedded in it, what this could do for the flooding issues that we have. What we're looking at here is a prairie pothole in a restored wetland at Sheldon Lake State Park. Has anybody been there? All right, Brian's been there. Nobody else. Well, oh, 2 hands. This is the closest state park to us right here. Maybe here we're closer to Brazos Bend, but from downtown it's only 20 miles. If you go to that state park and climb the observation tower, just up 65 feet, you can see downtown very, very clearly. And in the other direction, you can see this expanse of wetlands, about 400 acres, that have been restored and are full of wildlife. So this is a vision of what the land may have looked like pre-settlement. Oops, skipped a slide. All right, I mentioned stormwater wetlands before, and I want to explain what is the difference between a wetland and a stormwater wetland. First, again, this image of a typical detention basin. And then another detention basin. This one is in Australia. And you see it's part of a park. And so the question is, what do we want? Do we want this kind of land use? Or shall we explore this kind of land use? So what makes a stormwater wetland? Well, first, you study the site. This is an example in Alvin, which unfortunately was put on the shelf. And I hope we can revisit in the subsequent detention basins that they would like to build stormwater wetlands again. But for this first one, they were not quite ready for it. But we've got a good example of the design. So we studied this neighborhood here in the vicinity, which was running water into a channel, which was forced to take some right angles here, which water doesn't want to do. So this area constantly was flooding. This is where they put the first flood control basin. And we studied the contributions from the land, what kind of surfaces were there, what kind of water we could expect showing up in any type of rain condition. And then we designed. We designed for different depths. We designed for long flow through the wetlands so that the water had to spend more time in the plants, having more of these compounds that I mentioned taken out before it exited the system. And some other aspects of design. And then it's about controlling the outflow. This is something that's different from a regular wetland. We want the water to keep moving, but we want it to move at a rate that is designed slowly. So reshaping a basin, did it again. Reshaping a basin is part of it, so rather than having steep sides like this, we want gradual shoulders so that the wetlands have something to rest on. There's an exception to that I'm going to show. This is showing two outfalls, probably standing in front of it for you guys, and two different situations. And then we plant it. The plants that we choose are just a few, simple palette, and ones that were selected for beauty, so that it ultimately looks like part of a landscape, as opposed to wetland restoration, which we do, where diversity is the most important thing. We put lots and lots of plants in there. But in order to have people understand the wetland as an aspect of the landscape, we're going for color, we're going for kind of architectural, and we're going for fewer plants in large swaths. We grow them in a wetland, in a wetland nursery. We've got two of them. One is at the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory, and one of them is in Exploration Green, which is in Clear Lake City. And we have volunteer days at both of those. Usually they're during the week, but also we have volunteer days on occasional Saturdays. And some of you here have volunteered with us. Brian has. Anybody else? Okay, Abhishek, and what was your name?
Austin.
So glad that you guys came out. Really appreciate the volunteer help. It's what makes us able to implement these demonstration projects on really tiny budget grants, basically. We use nursery-grown plants for the most part. We plant fast colonizers. And again, the public participation is really key, so that people are invested in these landscapes that are going into their land, understand the concepts, and get the benefit of working with others. I mentioned the rapid coverage. We want to get good plants out there, natives, so that we don't have a lot of invasives cropping up. And after the fast colonizers, we plant the ones that are just really gorgeous. I think they're all gorgeous. Maintenance is an issue. We do have to mow it, but not as much as we would have otherwise. If it was a plain old detention basin with grass in it, constantly needs mowing, right? Well, you put water in there and plants, and it needs much less mowing. There's an advantage. We expect some replanting, and we have to do some invasive control. Negative perceptions. A lot of people say to me, when I mention that I work with wetlands, they say, well, what about the snakes? And so I like to talk to people about the snakes. The reality is snakes are in every kind of landscape type. Even on the beach, where the dunes are, we have rattlers. In the forest, we have snakes. Wetlands don't have a monopoly on snakes. Plus, a wetland is a very diverse system, and an established diverse system has got things like predators. The snakes are not the apex predator. So the snakes, are just fodder for other animals. Mosquitoes are another part of the wetland question. And again, in a well-established wetland, you've got lots of things that eat mosquitoes. Some of them we put in intentionally. We make sure that our wetlands have these guys. These are minnows. Our garden variety minnow here is actually well known around the country as a voracious mosquito eater. So other parts of the country export or they buy minnows to put into their detention basins. For us, they're free. We just go down to the ditch and get them. They will eat their weight in mosquitoes very quickly. I brought a brochure back there that talks about the amount of mosquito larvae that they'll eat. Another thing that you find are, dragonfly larvae. This is the skin of a cast-off dragonfly larva. They spend time in the water, depending on their species, it can be weeks or even years, eating mosquito larvae. They'll eat anything they can get their jaws on, really. And then they crawl out on a stem of a plant, and like a caterpillar, they shed their, not like a caterpillar, like a cicada, they shed that exoskeleton, unfurl their wings, and fly off to eat more mosquitoes. So managing perceptions is partly about getting the information out there and making sure that people can come to the wetlands, come to the nursery and see that there aren't mosquitoes, there aren't snakes in the nursery, and build grassroots support. Do you all know what nutria are? Okay, lots of words. This guy is a nutria. If you've been to Herman Park, you've probably seen them walking around in the day asking for handouts, it's unusual. They're nocturnal animals ordinarily. They're big rodents. They were imported from South America after the beaver fur trade collapsed. They have waterproof fur like beavers do. But they are such prolific reproducers that they will eat wetlands and almost any wetland species. So we found that when we plant a wetland, it's very likely that there are going to be nutria in the area that would like to eat it. So I found that there are a few species they don't eat, and we're planting those very heavily in the wetland. So it's not a exactly natural looking wetland, but at least it's better than a detention basin with very few species in it. They don't like iris, so I plant a lot of iris, and that's a good thing. Part of our testing of these species we did with a school down in the Clear Creek Independent School District. We planted with the kids, and then we had them come and monitor these species, the ones that they like and the ones that they don't like. And so we came up with this list of plants here, which I'd love to share with other people who are considering planting wetlands. An important part of what we do is outreach. I'm with Texas A&M Extension. It's kind of a bridge between the university and the people. We put in signs at our projects, engage student volunteers, master naturalists here, classes, publications. All right, last part. What do these stormwater wetlands look like in our area? I showed you one from Australia before. We don't have a lot of examples in this area yet, but the number is growing. And we've got some going into the ground now. This is Mason Park. It's in the East End, on Brays Bayou here. Oh, I've got more pictures of that. Constructed wetlands. That stormwater wetland is a type of constructed wetlands. Wetlands put to work for various purposes. This one here, stormwater wetland, is in Cambridge on the Alewife River. And it's a phenomenal looking place. I'd like to visit it myself. It won an award for the American Public Works Project of the Year in 2015. So I'd love to show that. It's a park, essentially. It's a stormwater wetland park. Other wetlands treatment, wastewater treatment wetland, you know what wastewater is, right? Basically, sewage. So this is at the end of the sewage treatment, they put it into a stormwater wetland to improve the water quality. They call it polishing. So this wetland it's basically all business here. You know, the water courses through the wetland, back and forth till the contaminants are out. This is one in the Middle East where you open body of water is rare, like an oasis. You know, they've got the water underneath the wetland and the plants growing up through gravel. And then finally, this is local. It's an unintentional stormwater wetland where the engineering failed and some water is collecting and the plants have taken advantage of that, and then the wildlife is coming too. Projects within this area. This is Galveston Bay here, and the different colors are watersheds. That's water that is collecting to a certain kind of waterway, like Clear Creek here. This is Brays Bayou here. Each one of these are color-coded by the watershed, and we are working with various partners to implement projects around the watershed, around Galveston Bay. Mason Park, which I mentioned again, it's got, 200 acres of watershed from this neighborhood here. Water is running off the streets into this large pond here, or deeper pond here, dropping out the sediment. The water runs into the next basin, and this aerial was taken before it was fully planted. So imagine it now with a lot of plants. This is where a lot of the compounds are taken up by the wetland plants, and then in the next cell, Bray's Bayou is tidal, so the tide comes in and out twice a day, and the tide takes the water that's been cleaned in the system out, merges with the rest of the bayou. This one was planted in 2006, and needs to be replanted or readjusted every now and then, but it was our earliest example of a stormwater wetland. Volunteers from various high schools and master naturalists were the people who planted for us. Exploration Green, again the one in Clear Lake City. It was an old golf course. Well, it was the neighborhood that was built for the NASA employees, and the concept at the time was cutting edge to have a golf course at the center of a neighborhood. But fads changed. The golf course wasn't able to maintain itself. There was the threat of having it sold off and developed into mid-rises and strip centers, but fortunately it was bought by an entity that wants to re-envision it as a stormwater wetland park with 5 lakes, and we're finally beginning to plant. In June we were able to plant this first section here. Let's see. That's a panorama which I slapped a picture on top of, but it's compartment 1 of a total 15 that will make the 5 Finger Lakes. And last week it looked like this. Here, we planted about 4,000 plants on either side, and we're looking through a nice button bush there. The excavation is ongoing, and it may be 10 years before we are completely done with this park. We're hoping that this is going to be a model for many, many more, not only in this region, but across the state. Pearland Nature Center. This is a pond at their John Hargrove Environmental Center that had curbs. It's a detention basin that had curbs and then the drop down to the water. There's no slope to plant a wetland on, so we are testing floating wetlands. It's a big mat of tangled recycled fibers that have these divots in the top. You plant in the divot, the roots grow through and take out the compounds out of the water. And the great thing about this is when the water level rises, the wetland rises. So it's very, changeable. So our demonstration project looks like this here right now. Just a few species that nutria won't eat. And we've had to replant once in a while, but we're learning a lot as we go. This was a great volunteer project too. And finally, at MD Anderson, several stormwater wetlands are going in, as well as the prairie. A lot of people know about the prairie that was put in the footprint of a building that was demolished. That is an effort to restore a prairie as close as possible to what you would have seen naturally, but also in other sites. This is not exactly the same. In other sites, we're adding the stormwater wetlands, which again are the wetlands that we're putting in for water quality improvement. There's one at Burtner and Old Spanish Trail. It's a little guy. Another small one that was put in, and now we're working on one that's about 8,000 square feet with several more that are being planned. Great. Well, I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you about this. I hope that you're interested. I'm happy to answer questions.
Let me get the microphone before we get into. It's up here, isn't it?
Yeah, it's right next to you.
Loud.
Right here. So that people can hear the question.
Loud.
Mike, there's one in the back.
Yeah, he's taking his
Susan had a
time.
question.
I can yell.
You need a mic. Everybody needs a mic. It's not optional. Use
You're
the mic.
worthy of a mic.
Okay, I have a list of questions, but I'll go. The first one that occurred to me was funding sources and land sources, and who brings the projects to you, but who pays for them, and where is land coming from? That's my first question.
Okay, well, the payment comes from, let's see if I can get back to the first slide. Well, anyway, my first slide had this banner at the bottom, and it had a lot of entities, just kind of underscoring that these projects are really a cast of thousands. One of my primary contracts is with the Texas General Land Office, but I've also worked with Galveston Bay Estuary Program, Texas Coast, drawing a blank. There's a number of Texas Parks and Wildlife, yes, and so the funding sources are continual, revolving. When we have the funding, or even before we have the funding, we're making partnerships with these organizations. I go out and I speak to people, spoken to drainage districts and to various entities, universities, and I'm finding that people are really receptive to this idea of implementing a wetland in a basin that they've already got to excavate, knowing that most of the waterways in this area are contaminated for something, and that there are benefits for that. Not only the environmental, but also policy is a big motivator for people. Everybody wants tourists with birding dollars to come to their community. So I'm finding that the partnerships, building the partnerships is fairly easy, and that the contracts, well, that's another story. We're all getting by on pennies, but it helps to have a passion for what you do as well.
Great. Let's. We have a question back here.
I'll come back. We got to get around. Let other people talk.
Yeah, I really got two questions.
Okay.
Is Story Park considered a wetland?
Is which part?
Story Park.
Art Story.
Just to the west of here.
Yes,
Arthur Story Park.
there are
It
wetlands.
looked like they were trying to do that,
Mhm.
even though it's quite deep.
Right.
And the other thing is, the other question is, what is the minimum size, practical size for one of these things? You're talking 8,000 square feet. That's not even a quarter of an acre.
No, there's a range. The small one that we put in the MD Anderson site was 2,000 square feet, which is kind of pushing the size, the practicable size, goes up to scores of acres. But at some point, really, you're looking at wetland restoration. And at some point on the other end, you're looking at, say, a rain garden in scale, small. Yeah. There was another question that I've already forgotten.
Story.
Well, get back with me. Oh, Arthur Story. Yes, that was a Harris County Flood Control District project. And they've been putting wetlands in primarily around the edges. So it's a similar concept, but the idea of the continuous planting that the wetland has to go through, the water has to go through before it exits the wetland, is something that we're pushing, in addition to other models that the Flood Control District is doing. So, good question.
Up around Eldridge, between Eldridge and Highway 6, there's a gray water retention lake pond.
Linden Park.
And my question is, what can we do about gray water since it's not drinkable and it's usually quite contaminated? I'm curious.
I've been hearing about that part, but I haven't been able to go and see it. The city has regulations about gray water reuse, and I think that those are beginning to relax as the need for conserving and using water more carefully and wisely is.
Will the plants be able to filter the water?
Yeah. Largely, it depends. There are certain species that do better than others, and there are some situations where they've found that runoff kills the plants and some kind of dilution needs to be done. There's a lot of research that needs to be done in this area.
I'm going to wrap it up with a final question because we're going to have to get going. And I don't know if you answered it when you answered Susan's question about funding, but like in terms of decision making, like who's deciding this stuff, and how can we help? Impact decision making on wetlands. I mean, is that a county thing, the city thing, combinations, or some,
It is combinations. What we do is put demonstration projects in, and we just kind of get lucky with partnerships. And we would like to be able to show this is what a stormwater wetland looks like, this is what it costs, this is how you maintain it, and so forth, and be able to build policy that way by demonstrating, rather than, talking about it is one thing, but actually bringing somebody to a site and showing them this is what a stormwater wetland looks like. We have a water quality monitor at the inflow and the outflow. This is what the data is, and hopefully the policy will come from that.
great. Will you be able to stick around for a few minutes and because I know some other people had other questions, but we're going to have to kind of wrap things up. So just a huge thank you to Mary Carroll for being